Oh, Matthew, thank you so much.
A little guess. It's 11, so the inquiry is resumed. I did say 5 past, didn't I? Yes, I did. Good. Just checking. That's okay. He's on his way. Any core docs you want me to have up, Miss Nevin, or will you go through them?
I think we can probably go to them as we go along. The usual suspects, the proofs really are the main things.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Ready when you are.
Good morning, Mr. Davis.
Morning.
So I'm going to start with some questions about the Western London cluster, but I'm not going to go over ground covered by my learned friend. I'm going to look at a slightly different angle on it. So just in cross-examination yesterday, my learned friend, Mr. White, asked you from a marketing perspective, what is the relevance of clustering in a UK context? So I'm a little bit hoarse, it might be crackly, apologies. And your answer was that there is a Dean Studio cluster in Western London, and you pointed to page 13 of your proof then. If you can go to that, that's the very interesting historical map.
Yes.
And you pointed out that this is the cluster that's been happening and evolving over generations. And so you rely on that historical evolution of the Western London cluster as a place that's evolved over generations to signal its importance today, correct?
Well, I think there's a distinction that I'd like to make here about the word evolving is the appropriate word, because obviously the evolution of TV has meant that some of the studios, that Highbury Studios, for example, or Gainsborough in Islington, have naturally gone. You know, this was 90 years ago. But what it clearly states is, or what it clearly shows, is that the general sort of evolution or direction of travel has been west, not central, not east, not south.
And you just spoke there about how that cluster has evolved over time, and so we do know that clusters just change over time, don't we?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, some clusters are very distinct. I mean, look at newspapers. It was all about Fleet Street until technology kind of, you know, disrupted that. But what has happened in this industry is that the sector has evolved. But what it has actually done is cemented the importance of West London as the de facto location, partially because, in my professional belief, is that there is a physical need for people to be in space, whereas other sectors that have clustered, it has been disrupted by, you know, the arrival of digital, frankly, newspapers.
Now, you put your finger on it, because I was actually just about to take you to your apt comparison of the Fleet Street cluster, and you mentioned other clusters. So that's a paragraph 7.15 of your proof. And you mentioned there that, yes, technology disrupted that cluster and the physical need to have newspapers located in Fleet Street. And so we no longer obviously have that physical cluster in Fleet Street, but we still do have newspapers, don't we, Mr. Davis?
Yes.
And you mentioned there about technology disrupting clusters, and you mentioned at paragraph 3.5 of your proof. You can go back there.
Sorry, which page is that? Sorry, it's playing up.
So I'm working off the paper as well. Well, we're just a little bit further over from the map. It's paper page 14, it's PDF page 13, I understand.
Yes.
And this is where you talk in that paragraph about VFX, so visual effects, and you say that currently that accounts for about 10% of TV production budgets, although could be higher for some films. And then just to draw up another point, so keep VFX in mind. If we look at Mr. Kershaw's proof, please,
Yes.
at page, paragraph 3.7.
Sorry, bear with me. Which core document number is that?
One moment. It's in the.
I've got the core document directory in front of me.
I'll pull up the CD number for you now.
Thank you.
13001. It's paragraph 3.7 in the proof.
Oops. 3.7, did you say?
Paragraph 3.7, it's PDF page 22.
Yes.
And this is where Mr. Kershaw talks about technology driving innovation in the film and TV production industry. And he references in this section concerns about the potential of AI on the industry, and this being the primary cause of the Hollywood strikes. And he goes on to mention Tyler Perry having pulled out of a studio development because of the concerns that perhaps the demand wouldn't be there given AI. So just in terms of what we were discussing on the evolution of clusters and technology disrupting the Fleet Street cluster, we can see that does provide us with a precedent for how a cluster in response to technology might evolve in a situation of needing less physical space.
Not necessarily. I think we've got to remember that we're dealing with a creative sector.
Mm-hmm.
As Mr. Bird referenced earlier about people making decisions based on a studio because of the name or the brand or the previous user experience, it is not as simple as saying AI is going to come and eat everybody's lunch. AI could play a part, but you can already see in all of our worlds how much governance is starting to come in because of the AI world. And certainly from my exposure to production companies and people within the industry, actually there's a real desire to make films the right way, human beings with cameras for human beings. So actually there's a lot of noise about AI, but in reality the sector is not going to see a huge amount of disruption. My own professional kind of prophecy is that it will be a complementary facet, just as if you take a film like Avatar, that was supposed to revolutionize the way that we do film. Well, doesn't feel like it. It's an interesting genre of film, but it hasn't changed the way that the filming landscape exists.
Yes, and it wasn't at all my proposition that people are going to completely disappear and there'll be no need for studio space. My point really was things like VFX and AI, those are facets of production that can be done remotely.
Well,
the interesting just to agree now, and just yes or no, and then absolutely add your riders, qualify. But just on VFX and AI, I think we can agree those are facets of production that can be done remotely as a matter of principle.
Remotely? Well, no. So forgive me, this might be too detailed, but the way that a virtual production stage setup exists, it's hugely capital intensive. We're talking millions of pounds for a set of screens that are there for a series of months. Technology is obsolete very, very quickly, so the ongoing capex is intensive, which has presented a lot of feasibility problems. And then from a usability point, you still need actors, actresses, technicians, etc., etc. The last point I'll make is that actually AI and virtual production really plays into the hands of the new high specification facilities because of the technological demands of them. So, for example, virtual production stages just crudely give off a huge amount of heat, which means that they have to have really high levels of HVAC to deal with that. You don't get that in heritage studios.
So just so I've understood your evidence then, is your evidence this inquiry that visual effects and AI aspects of production just cannot be done remotely? They have to be done inside a studio space, just so we're quite clear of what your evidence is on that.
To be factually correct, there are elements of things that can be done remotely, but at the moment, just to give you a bit of insight, when you're doing color grading for a film, so for example, let's use Top Gun 2, Tom Cruise sat in a studio in LA to do the color grading at Twickenham Studios with all the trained people who were good at, or industry experts at color grading. That has been going on for decades. So the point I'm trying to illustrate is there are always elements of the film industry, because it's digital media, that can be done remotely. It doesn't mean to say that all of this will suddenly drive a coach and horses through the necessity for physical space.
And that wasn't my proposition. I clarified that. But given that we have VFX and AI, I think we can agree these are emerging areas. And I'm not at all asking you to look into crystal balls. It's impossible. It's evolving so quickly. But these are things that can be done remotely. And it is possible, isn't it, that when we're looking at things like post-production, so things that happen after the shooting, that there will be, and it's possible, a shift will go towards doing more of that refinement through VFX and AI remotely.
Sorry, but post-production has always been done largely remotely. Larger studios like Pinewood and others have had post-production suites, but in terms of square footages, they're generally small compared to the bulk of studio space, which is sound stages, workshops and offices. Soho has always been one of the premier places to do post-production. That demonstrates to you that the sector has existed for years, having offset support functions for what is, the filming and execution of content.
And so we've agreed that these are aspects that can be done remotely. And so I think it can be agreed that, of course, if these things evolve and become more high tech and advanced, that will increase the ability of some of these aspects of production to be done remotely, just as a point of principle. That does follow.
It's really tough for me to comment on this because, frankly, it's an area that no one knows, and perhaps unless you're the head of Google, as to what AI will mean. But what I can tell you at the coalface of the industry is that the inherent preference is for content to be created in a physical environment. It's a well-trodden path for editing to be done remotely. That's nothing new, and it's also CGI work has been in the film industry for probably 10-15 years, but that hasn't impacted demand for physical space.
We move on to a different topic now. I just want to look at, just in terms of this question of where people live within a cluster. I think to my learned friend, Mr. Bird, in cross-examination, you said that the majority of people involved in film and TV live in and around West London. That was what you put in response to a point given by my learned friend.
Generally, yes.
But just can I clarify, have you got any census or ONS data before this inquiry that can give any specifics on exactly where people are living and who is involved in the film industry?
I haven't, no.
No. And yesterday, Mr. White asked you in chief about the relevance of location for film. And then I took a good note of your response. You quoted Beck2
Yes.
and the working hours of the day. And you mentioned that you've got about 400 to 800 crew, some on modest wages, who have to travel to and from studios on a daily basis. That was your evidence. And then you went on to say, if your house is more than an hour from your place of work, it becomes unsustainable to work on an elongated basis. And so what has happened over time is that the industry ended up moving and buying houses in the West London district. And that's an accurate depiction of summary of your evidence yesterday on that point. So just so I understand your evidence, you referenced Beck2. So is your evidence that does give a high level of protection, and then in terms of protecting people from having to travel too much from their home to their studio?
It's guidance. I mean, you'll hear from Ms. Waite from a practical kind of production management experience today, I think, about how it works in practice. But if you do live further away than a approximately an hour,
Mhm.
you are likely to end up in digs, i.e. paid accommodation for that period of time. Now, A, that adds a significant amount of cost to a production, which is undesirable, and B, anybody with caring responsibilities or, you know, family, etc., they're going to have a problem. So that really will skew the depth of crew that you're able to recruit for a production. And given that the crew base, as we've established, is generally highly skilled and highly sought after, it's about putting the A team together for your production, not necessarily agreeing to kind of second best.
Okay, so if you, on your evidence, if you live further away from that, I think 1 hour you said, you will get some compensation under the BEC2, and costly arrangements will have to be put in place for that.
You get per diems, that's the industry term.
Could we just turn, please, to Councillor Crabtree's proof, and
Sorry.
that's CD 13200.
Sorry. Yes.
And I'm looking for PDF page 58 of that, please.
15.
58.
Yep.
I'm looking at the section titled Travel, section 8. And if we look at the definitions, first place, production base is usually the place where the production office will be located and will be so unless designed in the deal memo. Producer can nominate one UK production base for each worker. So the production base, that's the studio, I think we can agree.
Generally, yes.
And then resident location is a place of work, continuing in the definitions, over 50 road miles from the production base where a worker cannot be expected to travel to and from each day. So the point of departure there and the 50-mile road restriction there is from the production base, from the studio, so not from a person's home.
Mm.
Then if we go on, it's paragraph 8.2, travel to production base. No payments will be made for time spent or costs associated with travelling from a worker's home to and from a production base. So we can see quite clearly the BEC2 doesn't say what you've put forward. It's that people don't get compensated for where they travel from their home, because where one lives is one's problem, frankly. It's actually from the production base outwards if you're filming on location. So just to correct that, I think we can agree that that's not correct, that people get compensated from travelling to the studio from their home, and that's what the BEC2 says.
Yeah, I didn't say that. I said that if you live outside of that zone, then you've got to have your accommodation provided for, or generally, so you've not got to. To get the people you want, you will then have to pay for their accommodation. On a day-to-day basis, if you're commuting within that zone, you get no compensation.
Okay, so can we agree then that just so I know we're aligned on that, it's the point of departure is from the production base, it's from the studio out to filming on location. It's not from one's home to where the filming will take place, and it's not from one's home to the studio.
The desirability.
Sorry to interrupt. You've got like a circle with circles.
Yeah.
That's helpful to look at for this context. Should we go to that?
So this is a guidance note that was issued by BEC2 to production heads. So it wasn't in the. Yeah, it's on page 15 of my proof, paragraph 3.15.
Then if we move on to paragraph 8.3, we can see the 30-mile radius referred to in the BEC2 is from the production base. So I just wanted to clarify that point with you. So we agree on where the payments come in for that. It's in relation to the production base.
I think it's worth me reinforcing the point around it's not just about, effectively financial compensation. It's about the desirability and the attraction of the right talent to come to you every day. But the fact of the matter is, it's not as simplistic as saying someone's going to get pence in the pound or, getting put up at the Ibis because their house is too far away. It's about how do you get the top talent to come and shoot at a certain facility.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify the point, just to make sure that we're clear that what you're not saying and what's not reflected in the BEC2 is that there's a financial incentive for people to live closer to a studio. It's in terms of the production base to where one is
Not
filming.
financial incentive. It's let's put it in a different way. It's recompense for the fact of the inconvenience if you don't live close by.
But it's from the production base out to the filming. So on a production basis, as we've agreed and clarified, that's not one's home, it's the studio.
Yeah, but the point, if you look at the guidance on 3.15, it clearly looks at your home. It states your home in the red with a red dot.
Yes, but you referenced BEC2 yesterday. That was what I was getting
This is
at.
the same guidance. So what this diagram is, this is actually a guidance note that was issued by industry reps in the UK that referenced the BEC2 directive. So it's a practical example of how it works on a day-to-day basis.
But I wasn't looking at the guidance. I was looking at the actual Pact BEC2 agreement, and I just wanted to be very clear of what that Pact BEC2 agreement said.
Well, that's right, but like with anything, where the statute issued, there then has to be practical recommendations as to how it gets implemented on a day-to-day basis. So what I've actually, instead of looking at just the text, I went one step further and looked at what the union rep advice was to people who shoot film, crew, will actually experience on a day-to-day basis. And I think the diagram clearly kind of demonstrates the necessity of being close to, on a regular basis, the production base and locations.
We move on then to a different point on the importance of the cluster. So you had a discussion, I won't repeat with you, my learned friend, in terms of Shinfield and Eastbrook. I won't repeat the points made there, but really just to look at Shinfield, your proof at 4.25 does recognise it is of a high quality, and you recognise there it must be considered as a competitor for Marlowe. And then yesterday in chief, you said to my learned friend that it's a prime example of a totally new build of high specification. If we could just look at paragraph 2.412 of the Knight Frank report, please.
Yeah. Sorry. Just to confirm, we're talking about Shinfield here.
We're talking about Shinfield.
Yeah. And sorry, which page of the?
It's the Knight Frank report. It's hard copy page 23, and it's.
Sorry, which page?
It's hard copy page 23. I'm not sure it's the same online if you're looking at the old Mike Davis and
23.
Yes, that's yes. But I'm not sure what PDF page number it is. If we're in where it's appended to your proof, it would be more than PDF 70.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So it's paragraph 2.412 where this discusses Shinfield.
Yeah.
And this paragraph clarifies that it's operated by Shadowbox Studios. Yep. And that Shadowbox is a US-based independent film and television studio platform.
Yep.
So we can see that Shinfield is operated by someone in the film studio business who has direct experience of operating a film studio.
Yes.
And they were quite happy to back an experienced person in the industry or company in the industry with experience of operating studios. They were quite happy to back Shinfield despite it being in Reading.
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution of that scheme because you're probably aware that the people who delivered the site originally are ex-Pinewood. They acquired the site as long ago as, I think the actual acquisition happened in 2020 on the upswing of the market. And at the time, you know, there was some really good demand out there for that scheme, evidenced by the initial lettings they did to Disney and then the sublet to Netflix.
I think the point is, so we've agreed these are people with experience in the industry, and so it obviously wasn't a deal breaker for them that Shinfield wasn't in the West London cluster. They were perfectly happy to back it and operate it regardless of that. I think we can agree that it's a point of fact.
Yeah, I mean, well, the nuance behind it is actually at the time there was a degree, and certainly when I was advising the lender, there was a high degree of analysis and scrutiny as to whether that location was right, and ultimately it was supported by the fact of the 2 production deals that happened in 2021.
Yes, and that was the historic position. That was the initial nerves on it, but they got past that, didn't they? And they were quite happy to back it. That's the end point of that discussion.
Oh yeah, I mean,
that they were happy
the
to
scheme
go with
got
it.
funded, it's been built. Yeah.
If we look then at Eastbrook, which you remind us is in East London, that's the UK's newest purpose-built development, isn't it?
Yes, on the basis it was reached practical completion last week. Yeah.
Yeah. And at paragraph 4.23 of your proof, this is where you discuss Eastbrook. You say here that the development is impressive. You recognise that in that paragraph of your proof.
Yeah.
And so if we look at who's behind Eastbrook, if we go to paragraph 2.411, please.
Chapman MBS.
Knight Frank again.
Sorry, which part of Knight Frank?
This is paragraph 2.411.
Yes.
I think it was PDF page 74 if memory serves.
Yep.
70, thank you. So 2.411, Knight Frank here mentions that Eastbrook is operated and managed by Studio Consulting and Production Services Company, the MBS Group, an affiliate of Hackman Capital Partners. And MBS Group is somebody also, again, who has experience of working with studios.
They're the world's largest supplier of studio management.
World's largest studio management company. Yeah. And Hackman Capital Partners as well. They wouldn't be their first studio to finance.
Michael Hackman's the largest private owner of studios in the US. Yeah.
Okay. So we're at the top of the top here, really. And again, like Reading, these really top industry insiders were perfectly happy to finance Eastbrook despite it being in East London.
Yeah, I mean the as I alluded to earlier, you know, all of the schemes have got their nuances around the financial aspirations of the funders and their time horizons. There are certain elements of this project that I'm aware of that are confidential around some of the way it's been financed, and some of the challenges it's had so far that aren't in the public domain. That's as far as I can go. The proof of the pudding will be how quickly it gets filled up, crudely. Yeah. Currently, it's vacant.
And you were talking yesterday, my learned friend in chief, about if you were approaching investors, and I think you said that if you were going to investors, it would be easier to sell the case for investment if you've got a studio in the West London cluster. But generally, but here we see 2 brand new, impressive, high quality studios with really experienced industry operators, you know, the top of the top from what you said in Eastbrook, perfectly happy to take a punt.
I don't think that last comment's fair. It's not a punt, is it?
They were perfectly happy to go. You mentioned the risks, you said, and the uncertainties, but despite that, they were perfectly happy to go with it.
Well, there were two points here. The first that you referenced. Could you rephrase the question, please?
It was my question was, I said, you mentioned some of the risks involved and the initial nervousness about investing. But then my point was, at the end of the day, what we've seen is when you take the operators and the financial backers, you see very experienced organisations, the top of the top in terms of Eastbrook, nonetheless very happy to go and back these studios, despite them not being in the West London cluster.
Well, yes, factually, they obviously backed them. So in theory, they were happy to go ahead. I think the important detail behind this is that those deals were, the sites were acquired and the transactions were funded and the finance was raised over a period between approximately 2020 and 2022. As I said before, that there's one thing acquiring a site, there's another thing actually building it and getting it full. And the point I was making, which I think is a more important point that I stated yesterday about it being easier, I say it from first-hand experience of various conversations I have on a regular basis with investors and their perception of where the purple patch of the West London cluster is. There's a lot of, I mentioned to Mr. White yesterday, there's still a lot of pent up equity out there that wants to get into the studio sector, but they have tolerance as to what they'll invest into. And that's generally derived from being in around the accepted cluster and being projects of scale.
If we just look now at the interaction of market forces, so to speak, with the confidence to invest in studios. Thinking earlier, I think it was yesterday in Evidence in Chief, when you were asked about the studios who've halted expansions or some even pulled out altogether. You said to my learned friend that it's impossible to draw a direct line and say that studios aren't going ahead because of market forces. And then you went on and you volunteered your views on there being an important distinction in that regard between people who are in the film industry or financial investors looking to turn the land, were the exact words you used.
Well, yes, yes,
Sorry,
yes, I did say that, and to qualify that, you know, as I think we've ascertained, every situation in this sector, but also with land, is unique based on, frankly, what their own commercial aspirations are. Mm-hmm. It's a fair and factual point to state that on a like-for-like basis, film studios are worth less on a capital value basis than pre-lets of industrial space, data centers, housing developments, etc., etc. So, frankly, if I was a private equity house looking at, generating the best return to my investors, then I'd be looking at all options, and that would include alternative uses, frankly, and that's what's happened in certain instances.
My point was, just so I understand your evidence, your argument is that people have that experience already in the film industry, have a better chance of success than people who are, to use your words, financial investors looking to turn the land.
I think.
Is it yes or no?
Yes. If you had to compare the two, I would, on the assumption that the people at the steering wheel were people with years of experience in the film industry, either production, making and sort of associated businesses with the right team, they have a better inherent understanding of the wants and needs of the customer base.
So we've had a look at who's behind Eastbrook and Shinfield, and we've established that there are experienced people in the film studio industry with experience of operating and financing films. Obviously, the appellant in this appeal is Dido Property Limited. So I'd just like to have a look at who's behind that. So it's Dido Property Limited. I guess we can assume it is what it says on the tin. It's a property company.
Yes.
And just in terms of who is behind Dido Property Limited, its directors are Simon Derek Barrowcliff, correct? I understand that.
Correct.
Yes, I understand that Mr. Barrowcliff works in the property development industry. I think at CBRE. He's got a consultancy role there.
Correct.
Then there's Robert Laycock, who of course we know has connections to the film industry, but I don't think Mr. Laycock has experience in operating and running a film studio.
Not to my knowledge, but I think, again, just to emphasize the point here, is that people, from my experience, the people who generally hold the deepest relationships and therefore are the best at directing productions to their facilities are the people with decades of experience at key senior levels of production companies. because not wanting to downplay the great work that studio operators do around the world, ultimately it boils down to how good's your relationship with X, Y, and Z company, and can you encourage them to come and use your facility. So if you want to put my client in a room with a variety of other people who have less or no filmmaking experience, let alone connections to the Fleming estate and James Bond, I know which one I would be prepared to back.
Yes, but that's not operating experience. I'm asking about the day in, day out experience of running a studio.
Yeah, but not every studio starts with an oven-ready management team in place that have run studios. I mean, Shinfield Studios started with a modest team, and they effectively went and took 2 or 3 people from Pinewood. So technically they started with very little experience. Other studios that arrive or have operated in the UK have generally been people within the industry. It doesn't always follow the route of an MBS coming along and I'm a global platform. It often starts in a much more organic way.
Yes, so you mentioned we looked at Shinfield Studios and said it started with a smaller team, but we established that it is operated by Shadowbox, which has experience in this area and of running.
Shadowbox is a company that's been going for about 5 years, started out in the US, a scheme in Atlanta. They didn't have anybody in the UK, and technically Shinfield was known as Shinfield Studios because it couldn't be called Shadowbox for planning reasons originally. So Shadowbox has technically kind of consumed what was originally Shinfield Studios, started by 2 English guys.
Well, I raised the point, Mr. Davis, because I'm responding to what your thoughts that you volunteered on why maybe some studios are being successful and others not. And you said, and you clarified that I had summarised your evidence correctly. It was that you said there's an important distinction with people who are in the film industry or financial investors looking to turn the land. So I'm responding to your theory on what drives success or what might lend a studio to failing, and that's why it was important to look in detail at that. So if we continue with Dido Property Limited, our last member on that is Ralph William Robert Thomas, the Lord Camoys, who I understand has no experience of operating and running a film studio either.
Not to my knowledge. I think what is quite frustrating to hear is the fact that there's no acknowledgement that the client might actually employ other people at some point in the future. You're assuming that the 4 guys will just sit there and run it themselves. They're going to build the business out. That's the usual methodology. You don't. 4 people aren't going to run 1 million square feet.
I never said that. The point of this questioning is what gives confidence to investors. That comes before a studio is built out.
So the way the investor, the way, all right. So sorry.
So of course, 4 people aren't going to run this whole studio, not at all. But you remember the line of questioning is what inspires confidence in investors.
Well, I have to say, I'll take a neutral's perspective for a second. Based on all the investor conversations I have, those entities, and we're talking global capital, they look at the credibility of the people standing behind the deal, and in instances like this, they acknowledge that it's about, frankly, who has the best CRM ability, who are the people in the room who are going to drive the customers to the facility. Everything else, crudely, operationally, gets taken care of. It's about recruiting people on a day-to-day operational basis. That's the simplistic way that these businesses get built.
We look at Pinewood Studios now. Would you agree that this studio is operated by people with a good grasp of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the last reckoning, on the Pinewood site employs about 200 people, something like that.
And Airmont Capital is the investor behind Pinewood.
They're the LP, yeah.
If we could please turn to the parliamentary committee, the parliamentary inquiry documents, it's CD 1310. It's PDF page 28 when you turn that up.
Sorry, CD
1310.
Yes.
And it's down the bottom of that page. It's Mr. Andrew Smith's contribution to that discussion. And here we see Mr. Smith saying that they have planning permission at Pinewood to build another 25 stages. We're going to adopt a very cautious approach to that development because we want to see where the demand is going.
Yes.
And you've obviously seen the press release last week. You referred to it earlier. There's going to be a public consultation in February, and that consultation then will begin a dialogue about the development options for the site. And the press release that we've seen says that one of the options they're considering over some of the area previously earmarked for that expansion is to consider a data centre. That's correct. That's where we've landed with that.
Right.
And so, given what we've looked at with the parliamentary inquiry, it's correct, isn't it, that Pinewood is doing exactly what they said they would at the parliamentary inquiry. They're adopting and have adopted a cautious approach. They want to see where the demand is going. And so in response to that, they've decided a data centre on some of that land is potentially a better option.
So I'm going to answer this from a perspective of an investor, a private equity investor. It's about making money.
Yes.
Inherently, data centers are worth a hell of a lot more in the current market, assuming you can get the power to the site, than film studios. I was fascinated to hear on a Bucks Business podcast prior to Christmas where Andrew was interviewed. He stated, "We're unlikely to build anything out at Pinewood without a long lease in place." I think it's worth everybody considering that when Airmont, who I know well, bought Pinewood in deal completed at the end of 2015, 2016, it was a multi-let studio in the traditional model. Subsequently, and very smartly, they've turned it into a single let campus, and Shepperton actually. So long-term income, and I probably don't have to tell everybody in the room that long-dated income to global corporate tenants means high capital value and a lot of money. What has happened in the intervening period is that at the moment, MLAs have paused. So from my perspective, why would you build more stuff out if you only were after long leases? I would investigate all other uses that would generate higher values, because that would be just prudent business planning. Whether they build it out, whether they do anything, remains to be seen. But the point I'm making is that it's not about production volumes, it's about their business plan.
Okay, so I put to you that Andrew Smith said that they would see where the demand is going. Then I put to you that the consultation on Pinewood seems to be a response to that. And then your response was investors. You went on to investors, so investors are concerned with what will make them the most money. Now, Andrew Smith didn't say to the parliamentary inquiry, did he, I'm going to take a cautious approach and consider my options as to what will make me the most money. That's not what he said. He said, I'm going to consider where the demand is going. It's a completely different proposition. He didn't say, I'll see what makes me most money.
Could I possibly highlight to you, it would be commercial suicide for him and Pinewood to say that at a parliamentary inquiry. And also just remind everybody that Pinewood is the vehicle that oversees the studios. They're not the investor.
But the only logical conclusion to draw from what Andrew Smith said at this parliamentary inquiry and the options they're considering for the site is that they don't see the demand going towards more studio space. They're readapting.
I disagree. I mean, it's perception and business plan.
Okay, well, let's look again at do you have the press release? I'm not sure it's up in the inquiry documents yet. Do you have a copy of that press release?
Press release.
Pardon?
Sorry, the podcast.
The press release. I don't think it's in the ID docs yet. I checked this morning. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah. From last week.
Yes, thank you.
The day we started.
If we could just turn over the page, please. there's a quote from David Conway there, the Chief Executive Officer of the Pinewood Group.
Yep.
And he's obviously explaining where this public consultation idea came from. And he says, we're a dynamic business in a fast-moving industry, and we are committed to invest in the ongoing expansion of Pinewood Studios. The reduction in global content production, combined with rising construction costs and business rates, triggered a review of our existing planning consent, and we believe the revised proposals provide a credible alternative. And so Mr. Conway here is alighting directly on the issue of a reduction in global content production, i.e. A reduction in demand for studio space that produces that content as a reason that triggered this review. That's exactly what that says.
It does. It's a very clever press release.
And we see a reference in that press release to the Prime Minister referring to Pinewood as the spiritual home of the British film industry. And we know they're in the business for a long time. And you've agreed that these are people with a good understanding of the business and good experience.
Yep.
And we know, don't we, that Pinewood, while taking Pinewood and their sister site at Shepperton, they've got Disney, they've got Netflix, they've got Amazon and MLAs, correct?
Correct.
And these are amongst the top OTT platforms, aren't they?
Yes.
And these are where the majority of the global production content spend comes from, aren't they?
And not the majority. I mean, we discussed at length there are, probably another 3 or 4 companies that would be in the same bracket.
Yes. Were you here when I discussed with Mr. Chadorovich and we looked at the various graphs?
Yes.
We can see, can't we, on those that Netflix and Amazon are really the top ones. We can see we looked at a graph with the lines. They're the ones driving the majority of the production spend. And so, well, given you've got the top producers, the top content producers in the world at Pinewood, you would consider that they've got quite a good insider view, wouldn't you, on the short and long-term prospects for content production? That naturally follows.
It would, yeah. I mean, the insight they would have would be very good and interesting. However, they won't know everything because it's not in the interest of the production companies to reveal their hand. Would Pinewood have known that Amazon were going to buy Bray? No. So the point I'm trying to illustrate is the fact that they themselves have a good intel, probably better than average intel.
Yeah, that's the point.
But equally, I think it'd be remiss of us to think that there's going to be no future evolution of those companies, no future requirements for those companies, and also eventually, MLAs come to an end, don't they?
If you're looking at all of that from investor perspective, you've got the top amongst the top in the industry with Disney, with Amazon. You've got it backed by Airmont Capital. If you were an investor observing all of that and this development with the possibility of a data center, it would make you quite nervous about investing in a new studio, wouldn't it?
So, sorry, am I answering that from the perspective of Airmont?
Just as an investor, if you were an investor stepping back and having a look at all of this and looking at Pinewood Studios with its reputation and its experience and its location, all of those things, and looking at the kinds of production content it attracts, your Disneys, Amazons, you'd be quite nervous, wouldn't you, about going in and investing in a new studio of that size and as a competitor as Marlowe would be?
So without mentioning specific investor conversations that I'm having as in this week, what's been fascinating actually is dissecting the noise in the industry versus the commercial reality, is because going back to the point when Mr. Bird was cross-examining me about pipeline and availability of grade A, there seems to be this sort of perpetual noise in the market about how much lack of demand and too much supply. And I think what we have demonstrated is when those BFI statistics come through at the end of the week and we see that this is the 3rd biggest year of spend on record, And then you hear from Ms. Waite about lack of availability at Grade A studios from a production basis right now. There's a clear disconnect between information that's been put out historically. You know, those DCMS hearings are now, one was March last year, one was May last year. Things have changed and continue to change. And it's, as I mentioned yesterday, it's a fast moving sector. And so the conversations I'm having with investors is actually how people are looking to pick up the pen again, because actually they see the opportunity because other people, frankly, aren't bringing forward projects for various reasons.
If we continue sort of from the investor perspective, we go please to 4.20 of your proof. This is where you look at Sunset Studios.
Sorry, bear with me a sec. 4.20.
Paragraph 4.20 of your proof, where you discuss Sunset Studios.
Yep.
We can see that Blackstone originally bought the site, and they did that in a joint venture with Sunset Studios. And I think we can agree, it's common knowledge, Blackstone is quite a big investment company, aren't they? They're globally quite well known. And we see there that Sunset Studios have paused their construction, and they've cited various challenges there that we can read. And again, you know, we've got a big investor like Blackstone with quite a big reputation globally, and it's not worked out for them. So my point is, again, the same thing. If you're an investor looking at that, looking at Airmont Capital at Pinewood, looking at Blackstone investing in Sunset, and that not quite working out in the way anticipated, wouldn't exactly inspire confidence, would it?
There are two ways to answer this. The first, and I've got to be very careful about what I say, because this is, again, under NDA information, that the business plan at the point of acquiring that site was on a certain basis. The business plan today would have to be different from that basis. And so sometimes the assumptions that you make on the way into a property transaction end up changing, and it's difficult to implement. Secondly, I think this is the most important thing in terms of relevancy to Marlowe, is the fact that actually from an investor's opportunistic standpoint, it's great to see quite a few of these schemes not happening, because fundamentally it means that Marlowe will probably be the only show in town because of the conviction of the client to deliver it. You think about it, going back to the point we made before about pipeline and availability, what are we talking? We're talking about Shinfield, we're talking about Eastbrook, we've talked about the strengths and weaknesses of all those. And then if you go through the pipeline of the remainder, what have we got that's really going to come through that will contribute net additional supply to the market, i.e. that isn't spoken for by a major production company and is in the West London cluster?
But they will be quite alive, won't they, to what we saw with a Pinewood at the Parliamentary inquiry, saying we'll keep our options under review and we'll see where the demand is going. I mean, that is obviously something that's going to be in the forefront of the mind. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, these companies or these studios are dropping out. No, they're dropping out for a specific reason. It's because we see they're saying, well, we're not getting the demand. Yeah, but sorry, that's not how business is done. These global investors don't hang their hat on a parliamentary inquiry that's almost a year old. They do forensic DD. They speak to people like me. They have contacts within the production market. You know, these people are infinitely resourced and will determine using up-to-date, credible information sources, not someone standing up an inquiry a year ago with sentiment. You know, whatever. Pinewood are absolutely entitled to do what they want to do on their estate. Frankly, I think the Airmont guys are great. I would do a data center as well. In fact, I'd probably do 3 data centers on that site, because if it's about commercial return to the investor pool that they have, that will create an incredible amount of value because of the growth of the data center sector that we're seeing, because it's critical infrastructure right here, right now. That is not a bellwether of the studio
and production market.
We've not just looked at the parliamentary inquiry, have we? We've looked at very up-to-date information, a press release released just a few days ago where we see David Conway talking about reduction in global content production. We've also had the introduction of the home of production in Bedfordshire, with the investors pulling out there. So we're not just hanging our hat here, are we, in this discussion on a parliamentary inquiry report from a year ago. We're discussing very up-to-date developments. We're looking at Sunset Studios as well. All of that's up to date.
If I may, could I just remind you of the specifics of HOP? Because I was involved in that project after, the reason why that scheme didn't go ahead is because the development management company which optioned the site from the landowner didn't take any commercial due diligence on that site. They got a very good planning consent from a design perspective, but it turns out it wasn't attractive in the market. And also the cost of remediating 143 acres, most of it were under 50 centimetres of water, killed the development appraisal, which meant that it was unfeasible from a financial perspective. And as for the press release, as I would expect, Pinewood are extremely well advised. It's a very good press release.
You just mentioned now with the home of production in Bedfordshire that you had a gravel pit there, and there was quite a big decontamination cost that came with that. There's striking similarities.
Decontamination.
It was said decontamination.
Accumulation.
There was a land remediation cost with that. You said there was decontamination that had to be done.
It wasn't contamination, it was a brick
remediation.
Correct.
Yes, we've got quite a similar site here, don't we, with Marlow Film Studios?
No.
You've got an old sand and gravel quarry.
The remediation of the HOP site was actually to do with water extraction, because it was a brick quarry and approximately 70 acres worth of it was had about 50 centimetres worth of water coverage. Also, to go into real specifics, the consent involved building a 70-acre platform, which created a disproportionate amount of sunk costs. And the only way that scheme would stack up financially is if they pre-let all of it to a single occupier on a 15-year lease. Now, if they'd known that when they were looking at the site originally, which I would have happily informed them of, they wouldn't have acquired that site.
Could we turn, please, to Mr. Sensicle's proof of evidence, and that's CD8011 ABC, and that's PDF page 80, please.
Sorry, so that CD what, sorry?
CD811 ABC. It's Mr. Sensicle's proof of evidence in the appellant's opener.
Yes, yep.
You have that. And page PDF page 80, please.
80.
Yes.
CBRE letter, yeah.
Yes, you referred to this letter yesterday in chief with my learned friend.
Yep.
And so CBRE, just to confirm, that's a commercial real estate service, correct? Just to confirm who CBRE are.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that Mr. Barrowcliffe, one of the directors of Dido Property Limited, also is a consultant at CBRE. You confirmed that earlier.
Correct, yes.
And this CBRE letter, what it is, isn't it? It's a letter looking at the investment market dynamics. And this letter was produced to support to support that case, really, wasn't it, for Marlow Film Studios, that there's a favourable investment market out there for it. That's why this letter was produced to this inquiry.
Yeah, correct. It was to give context from an international investor perspective as to the facets of Marlow Film Studios.
Yes, and if we look just under funding sources, please.
Yes.
Where it discusses credit availability, and we see that just looking at the first paragraph, financing is contingent on securing planning consent, with the infrastructure and development finance anticipated to be funded with a combination of debt and equity. Therefore, prior to receipt of a planning green light, there would be no expectation of firmly committed funding, although we understand that initial interest has been shown by international investors. We've no proof of that before this inquiry, do we? We don't have a letter from a potential investor saying, I'm interested. If you get the planning permission, I'm happy to put myself out there.
No, you're correct. But the what has happened has been a number of conversations with global sources of capital. Again, from my professional experience, the way it works, certainly at this level of spend, and also the type of investors, absolutely planning is the gateway to getting funding, because frankly, as we know, the lead-in time to getting a planning consent eats into the IRR requirements of these investors. So what they like to do is effectively say, yeah, we'll have a series of conversations, but we're not going to commit to anything until you get that planning consent.
But we've no evidence before this inquiry of those conversations or anyone being concretely interested, do we?
You don't know, but the way that industry works is that these sources of capital don't often like to go on record.
Thank you. I think another birthday present for you, ma'am. I'm finished now, a bit ahead of time. Thank you, Mr. Davis.
It's much more ahead of time than I expected. Okay. It's 12. It's a bit early for lunch. Should we just? Oh, sugar, yeah.
Birthday.
Getting all carried away. I've got some questions as well. Any interested parties objecting want to ask any questions? Yes. Would you like to? Yeah, come forward. Definitely come forward. I'm just trying to work out where you can grab a mic.
I'm
Perhaps
happy to let him sit here.
Oh yes, okay.
Yeah.
Could you just remind me of your name, please?
Certainly.
As well, thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Joe McNeil. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, Mr. Davis.
Morning.
Mr. Davis, are any of the Tier 1 and studio expansions that you have experience with similarly constrained or compromised by very close proximity of residential dwellings, as is the case of those existing at Westhorpe, which are directly adjacent to and somewhat encircled by the development being examined in this inquiry?
It's a good question. So, sorry, just to confirm, are you talking about grade A studios? So what we've established as the 5 or 6 that we've talked about this inquiry being adjacent.
End of the question. Are any of the Tier 1 and studio expansions that you have experience with local or global? That's a fairly narrow definition.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can give an unequivocal answer on that. I need to do there's quite a bit of research to give an answer. I mean, there are obviously examples of existing studios in residential areas that are being expanded. So Ealing Studios, for example, is in a conservation area. They're building new space out. Twickenham Studios is in an established urban area. So, it's a situation whereby there are studios in the UK that are established, that are in residential areas. Frankly, I'm struggling to picture all of the land masses of all of the extensions and all of the new developments that are to figure out their urban perspectives. I assume I can't come back on that question once we.
No, and it's obviously just in your experience, and it's off the top of your head. I mean, your evidence isn't really about where residential houses are located in relation to studios. So it's just, if you know, if you don't, that's fine. We can move on to the next question.
Within the confines of this hearing today, I couldn't give a definitive answer on that.
Thank you. you got any more questions?
No, that is the end of my question. I think that just for clarity, the key word in my question. I beg your pardon?
It's questions. So if
Okay.
you've got any more questions, please ask them. If you don't,
No.
thank you
No,
very
I'm
much.
finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for coming up and asking. Yeah, so you talked about it being planned in phases. It might not be planned in phases, but it might be. There evidence you talk about that Shinfield was planned in phases. How would that look time-wise, or is that a question for Mr. Sensical?
Probably mainly for Mr. Sensical, but it depends what the business plan is. Depends who the production company is. Depends how quickly it gets traction. I'd like to be able to give you the definitive answer, but it's site specific.
Okay. And then you say in your conclusions that approving the studio scheme is as much as a defensive measure for the UK GDP as it is about innovation in the sector and the evolution of studio space. So how does that relate to an identified need for additional studio space, as it being a defensive measure rather than identified need?
Yes, sorry. On reflection, actually, and without wanting to confuse the issue, it's defensive and it's offensive at the same time. If we don't innovate and we don't build high quality facilities, as I mentioned in my proof and has been alluded to elsewhere, there are other markets in Europe. I'm working in some of them who are out there to steal business from the UK and are building new facilities. And also the point that was made by Mr. Jodorowicz yesterday about, frankly, taking more market share globally, particularly from the US.
Okay, understood. Thank you. And I think that's it. Yeah, because the other ones have really been answered and you've gone over them. Okay, Mr. White, would you like to re-examine your witness now? And thanks for reminding me.
David, I'll just turn it on. Yes, could I take you back to Mr. Bird, please? And remember there was the line of questioning about the 2.09 million square feet?
Yes.
And you accepted the maths, and I'm not going to trouble the maths, but I just want to go back to the table that was the source of that line of questioning, please. Could you take it up? It's on your page 20.
Yes. The table at the top.
Yeah, the table at the top. And you made a point in answer about the pipeline uncertainty. I just want to ask you your view. To what extent, with the knowledge that you have and you've told this inquiry about, first of all, quantitatively, to what assurance or comfort is there in your view that the 2.09 will be delivered or not delivered?
Low.
Secondly, let's deal with qualitatively. In the 2.09, what is your judgment as to what quantum of that 2.09 meets the same quality as Marlow, please? What level do you estimate reaches the same quality as provided or might be provided at Marlow, please?
So if we work on the assumption that all of this list could be in theory delivered, that in terms of quality, actually, can I just take a step back for a second, because I think there's even more of a distinction between, you could go through this and say, a number of these studios are going to be new build, therefore there's an implied level of quality from a kind of operational perspective. From a design perspective and a kind of urban realm perspective, none of them will be as good as Marlow. From a deliverability point of view, and things that I think have a slightly better than odds chance of being delivered, Pine Wood in theory, but we've talked about all of the reasons why that's not going to come through. Sunset, that could be, but again, we've talked about that, probably won't come through. Warner Brothers Leavesden would be good, but again, it's spoken for their production traffic. Sky Studios North, that could be another good scheme, but that will be spoken for Comcast traffic. And who knows what's going to happen at Bray, but that will be an Amazon foothold as well. So as you can tell, there's very little there.
And can I just ask, yes, can I ask you a question of, because my learned friend Miss Nevin put a series of questions about Shinfield, and I think there's a degree of ambiguity. The questions were predicated on the assumption that Shinfield's not part of the West London cluster. Is that a judgment you agree or disagree with? Is your judgment in the market, is Shinfield in the West London cluster or not?
But the simplistic way of explaining is it's an evolving story, because that studio has been open for a year and a bit, and it is slowly being adopted by the production world into being an acceptable place to do business.
Now, let's then, in terms of the various questions asked by Mr. Bird about qualitatively and quantitatively about whether there is a need or not, can I just ask you this? Does the market judge film studios principally on the quantity they provide, or is there inherently a qualitative judgment about what is being provided?
Repeat that again.
Yes, of course. Does the market look, when it looks at provision of film studios, does it look just at the quantity, i.e. the 2.09 million, or does there also a judgment about quality and what will be provided and how it will be provided?
Yeah, it's absolutely about the quality of the environment. And by the way, we're not just talking about the age of the facility and the interior levels of specification, because as you'll hear this afternoon, the wants and needs of the major production companies have grown. So it's about all the add-on facilities. We've talked about training, but canteens, gyms, creches in some instances. There's a whole roster of things. Those don't get factored into, individual buildings or smaller studios because they're unable to physically put them in there. So to that extent, it's about the overall package.
Now, can I also then please ask you about just a few points about Miss Nevin's questions, please. Miss Nevin put the point to you that you haven't provided ONS census data about where effectively the crews live and work. But I just want to ask you, what evidence do you have for the expressions of view you express about the crew and the attraction of the West London cluster? What is your evidence based on in reaching the view of the relationship between location and the ease or not of acquiring crew for productions, please?
It's my years of experience dealing with production companies and studio owners and investors.
Can I then also ask about various questions were asked about the approach of the occupiers, particularly Pinewood, and their view and whether they would be informing the decisions about Pinewood's investment? Do you recall that?
I think I did, yeah.
Well, can I just ask you, in an MLA, is the commercial interest of those that offer the MLA and those that take the MLA the same or not? I mean, in simple terms, you're a surveyor. Is a landlord and a tenant, do they have a mutuality of interests in terms of their agreements?
No, they've got different objectives.
Well, exactly. Explain. What are those different objectives?
Well, crudely speaking, from an investor or an owner's perspective, you want a long lease at a market rent or a guaranteed rent with a good covenant, because that's financeable and generates a high capital value. From a production company or a tenant's perspective, what you're effectively doing is land banking space, which gives you the ability to guarantee production space for your productions, which I think we touched on yesterday briefly about, because of the short lead in time, because of the way films are financed, being able to guarantee space as a good studio facility is absolutely paramount, if you excuse the pun.
Well, let me just imagine. Let's imagine in a golden future, Andrew Smith thinks I'm going to get Davis to provide advice when we discuss the MLAs in 2029. And you have an initial meeting with Amazon in the position of thinking what price the MLA should be pitched at. If Amazon come into the meeting and say, my goodness, the market's phenomenally strong, would that have an influence on the price that the MLA might be purchased, or would it be completely irrelevant?
It could well have a factor.
Thank you. next point, I just want to deal with this, the inference in some way that Mr. Barrowcliffe's professional position is influenced. I don't know whether it was, but let me just deal with this. In your experience, you worked for 12 years for major international surveyors.
Longer. I worked for 18 years.
All right, 18 years. Can I just ask you, what is the threshold by which an executive director of a multinational surveying firm will opine in the public domain? I mean, is it something that they're generally casual about, or they take seriously what they say in the public domain, particularly in the context of a public inquiry? What's your view on that, please?
No, very seriously. I mean, that CBRE letter will have been written to stand up to scrutiny. You know, the inference that they could be, swayed is remarkable, frankly.
Now, also in relation to Dido, and there's this question about what will happen in the future, and I just want your experience, having seen since September 24 their approach to this inquiry. I want your judgment. Has their approach to this inquiry been effectively to be the only ones giving evidence to get a planning consent, or have they sought experts in the field to advise them on this matter?
Refreshingly, they came to a group of us who are considered hopefully experts in this particular field. And also, I think it's worth saying that given the pain of the appeal and the considerable cost, I think personally it speaks volumes about their determination to see the project through and the belief factor in delivering a state-of-the-art studio.
Now, how many studios professionally have you had contact with in your career?
I couldn't tell you. I mean,
well, tell me in your experience, just roughly. Let's look back in the past. How many studios have you had a professional relationship with, frankly, who have effectively run the show completely by themselves, or have taken professional advice on areas beyond their expertise?
Well, my only barometer is the amount of times that I've been called by people who own or invest in studio to give advice. I mean, that's, probably over 30, less than 50 off the top of my head. And that, by the way, that includes UK and Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mum. That's my re-examination, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will break for lunch now. It's just gone, well, it's about 25 past, so we'll come back at 25 past 1. Is that okay with everybody? Yep, okay. And then we'll hear from Miss Waite. Is it Miss Waite? Mrs. Miss? Thank you. Just so I know. Okay, we're adjourned for lunch. Thank you very much.